Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. Is now the time to capture the lessons from COVID-19. By way of introduction, for those who don't know me, my name is Sam Leighton and I am the Regional Airports and Industry Development Manager here at the AAA. Today we're presenting Capturing the Lessons from COVID-19 that will be presented by Matthew Harper. Matthew is the Managing Director at Resilient Results. These presentations take a lot of time to prepare, and I'd like to thank Matthew for preparing this webinar for us today. So in terms of a little bit about Matthew, for almost 30 years, he's worked professionally in emergency and crisis management roles, including time with Air Services Australia, Emergency Management Australia, Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, plus many other agencies, individual businesses and government organisations. He has worked extensively across Australia and the Asia Pacific in emergency, crisis and business continuity management as a program manager and leader, facilitator and exercise manager, developing plans and helping organisations to transfer these plans into operation. As always, the opportunity to ask questions will also be provided. To ask Matthew a question, please type your questions into the control panel and press the send button. All questions will be answered at the end of Matthew's presentation. So without further ado, let's begin.
Thanks, Samantha. And thank you everyone for joining us this morning. Welcome to the nation's capital, where it's currently a grand 11.8 degrees, but it's only feeling like 6.3. So it's quite tropical from what we've had. So we're here to talk about, is this the right time to start capturing the lessons from COVID-19? And it's a really interesting topic. Certainly we've moved already in the phases of COVID-19 from what people are doing actively in COVID-19 through to, we've been through response, we've been through sort of this semi-recovery phase. We're in this really weird place at the moment. So is it the right time to capture the lessons? And I think the first thing I'd like to really point out is this is not about emergency management. This is not about crisis management. This is about operational life. This is about changing an organisation and making sure that your organisation can move forward. So what I'd like to go through today is a little bit of why start now, move on to what are lessons. So when we're talking about lessons, what are they? And then go through a bit about the lessons management cycle, what I think folks can do right now on their own in their own organisations, and then have some time to really do some question and answers. So the big question I'm getting from lots and lots of organisations at the moment is, isn't this just too early because we're still in isolation, we're still trying to work it out? That type of stuff happens at the end of the process, and that's probably right for your average, building fire, your average takeover, your merger, your massive change in operations. But this is going to be a long process. So we really have to start thinking of these big three questions. Where have you been and what's happened? Have a really good assessment of where you are now and actually know where you want to be, because what I'm seeing with a lot of organisations that we're working with is where they want to be isn't where they are now, and it's not necessarily where they have been. There's so many organisations that are actually seeing this as opportunity to thrive, opportunity to change direction, opportunity to do things in a different way. And whether that's being driven by outside processes, they have to make those decisions. So let's have a bit of a think about pandemics first. So there's some fundamentals about pandemics over history, and really pandemics end in one of three ways. First way is the pandemic itself basically kills the host. So probably thinking Black Death, as Black Death sort of moved around Europe and it absolutely decimated Europe, it just got to a point that the plague itself couldn't keep replicating. There was so much death, people just weren't there to survive as hosts. The rats started dying off and eating each other because there wasn't the food left, so the host effectively died. But the bubonic plague itself didn't go away. It just recessed away, but we were no longer faced with a pandemic. A case like Ebola, very different. Ebola evolves or it disappears. So the last, the 2015 outbreak of Ebola, there's a real question on whether it actually evolved into a different Ebola or whether it died out. And Ebola is a bit funny. It's very temperature sensitive. It only lives in a very narrow range of temperatures. It's very dependent on a range of other environmental factors that we don't fully understand. And it's also very much like COVID, very dependent on people having very close contact. So Ebola typically emerges and dies out. And if you're following the news at the moment, Ebola has emerged again in Africa. So we've got some places in Africa that are simultaneously dealing with COVID, poverty, and Ebola. So pandemics do come and they do go. The final way that we get rid of a pandemic is we get a vaccine, or we just no longer fear the cause of the pandemic or the effect of the pandemic. And in particular, there's two diseases there that we no longer really fear and we no longer see as pandemics. That's probably polio and measles. And it's an interesting study that in Australia, we've pretty much eradicated polio, except for the occasional outbreak. We wander in and out of being technically free of measles on a regular basis. So we have a vaccine for both diseases. We haven't eradicated it from the world. We have effectively controlled it in Western society. So at the moment, really where COVID is we're heading towards that polio measles world. But polio, we found a vaccine for in the mid-50s, and we still haven't eradicated it from the world. It took 10 years in Australia to really get polio under control. It took even longer in the USA. So even if we get a vaccine, we are in for a long-running event. So just to think of those things. COVID could very well just alter its state and become no longer a threat to humans. It's unlikely that it will kill everyone. So probably our most likely scenario is some form of vaccine or control method where we just no longer fear it, but we are still going to have to live with COVID-style prevention activities all the way into our future. A parallel for those sort of certainly people in their 40s or 50s would be, if you think back to being a teenager and AIDS and HIV coming out, really it got treated very much like a pandemic worldwide. We just got to the stage that we didn't fear dying from it anymore. We have a variety of drugs, so people no longer typically die, but they do go on to a lifetime of drug treatment. So it's that type of fear stopping, but you're always changing a habit at some stage. So let's keep that in mind as we go through of why we really should start learning our lessons now. And maybe there's a little bit of some reflection here, which is interesting. I'd really like you to try this as we go along. So on the left-hand side, they're the big markers from the World Health Organization that we probably remember really quite well. 31 December, they claim they saw it the first time. 30 January, a public health emergency of international concern. And 11th of February, it was called COVID-19. I've looked back and I've tried to work out what my first signs of COVID were and what my first changes to my business were. And I've come down that somewhere around the 18th to the 20th of January, I wrote my first article and had it published on the 21st of January. We'd just come out of the bushfires in southeastern Australia at that stage. Canberra was still a bit smoky, and the focus very much for the business community in Canberra was recovering from bushfires, recovering from the massive hailstorm we just had. There was no appetite for even thinking about COVID. But on the 21st of January, I got an article released in the local business chamber with just simple steps that people should start doing. So in my mind, I started my journey at about the 20th of January. Look at my notes this morning. On the 27th of February, a good month later, I was preparing an exercise for a client, and I'd actually used COVID as a potential scenario of, how would we actually shut down an IT department? And the client actually said that we weren't going to use COVID. No one thought it was that realistic. Let's just leave it. 4 days later, I was hired and I was in at Canberra Hospital doing their COVID response plan just to try to get them up and going because we were starting to really react to COVID. So we accelerated incredibly quickly, and in somewhere in that phase, I know I contacted my bank. I know I rearranged how my superannuation was being organised. I know I spoke to my subcontractors. I had my first jobs cancelled, and we changed our habits. So somewhere there, I've got lessons that I should have learned, and I'm already myself making sure that I have learned those lessons. So what's the difference between lessons and a lesson learned? And they're two terms that have been used for countless years, really, particularly in the emergency services world, where people talked about lessons learned. But the problem was, it was actually, they'd made some observations and somebody might have done something with them. So the current thinking is that a lesson is knowledge or understanding gained by experience, but a lessons learned is when you've actually made the change. And the question is, how do you take that lesson to the lesson learned? So that's where we're going to look at that. How do you do that change? So the lessons management process then becomes the process from learning the lesson, where we are now, what we're going to start our journey on, to actually making the change and monitoring the change going forward. Because you can learn a lot of lessons. Where do you actually make the changes and then make sure the changes are put in place is another question entirely. So let's just have a bit of, let's go back to COVID and where are we? I'm seeing a lot of people sort of draw this sort of bell curve that's on the left hand of the screen of how things are evolving. And if you think back to that Ebola chart, that's a really common Ebola scenario. The disease develops, it gets to a point, slight weather change, everything comes back. And you are probably out of the scenario within a month or 2 months. It's a common result. It's what seasonal flu does. That's how we see it. But let's look forward at COVID, because we don't know enough about it just yet. And the reference for this document on the right is at the end of the scenario, end of the presentation. But there are 3 scenarios that a range of medical schools are looking at and trying to study COVID and trying to predict where this is going. Scenario 1, which is the peaks and valleys, is we just keep getting peaks, and that's usually about control has been implemented, and then as controls ease off, more people get it, we get another peak. Controls ease off, we get another peak. It will be interesting looking at how we're going in Australia and overseas as we come off these peaks now, and whether they come back. Scenario 2, it's a US document, so it's their autumn, that actually they might get a second peak that is bigger than the current peak that they're going through at the moment. So you'd probably think that they're on that second bump in the graph, and that they may have a much bigger peak at the end of summer. Scenario 3 is a really interesting one, and we're possibly somewhere now in that second peak, heading towards that third peak, where maybe for months and months and months and months, we will have this recurring re-emergence of COVID, businesses shutting down, businesses starting again. people going into quarantine, coming out of quarantine, but we might stay on this journey for a long time. The reality is at the moment, we don't know where they are, where we are or where they are. So we have to take a guess. Which one of the yellow arrows are we actually on? I'm thinking from what I'm seeing, we're possibly in scenario 3 in Australia. I think we're coming off our peak, and I think we're going to keep down there, but we're going to be living with a level of COVID for a long time to come. So the question is, organisationally, if you're going to go and learn some lessons or gather some lessons, learn them, make changes, what are you doing this for? What do you want to be? Where do you want to be? And in working with a couple of organisations, these are the big 4 things that people typically come up with. They like this concept that we talk about of resilience, this organisation that can come back from issues, can bounce back, but they don't like this concept of bouncing back. They don't actually want to be damaged that much. They want to be ready to pivot for the next normal. And this has come out really strongly in organisations that have a really heavy customer focus. Organisations like childcare centres, arts groups, they realised after that first shutdown, they have to be ready to just swap their business for whatever new normal becomes apparent. And they're ready to do that. They want to be able to go back to what worked really well last time. And if probably the easy one that we all really know and we can all really relate to is if you've got a favourite coffee shop who's suddenly discovered that they can actually serve coffee outside, have very little contact, and actually build a really quite good business on it. They want to go back to their old way of trading, but they want to come back really quickly. And I'm seeing that how do we write a plan to reinstitute quickly come out in a lot of organisations. You know, what does reinstitution look like, and what are the thresholds that you start reinstituting? And then the final of the big 4 has been, we really want to avoid what didn't work. Not so much what went wrong, but what didn't work, the activities that didn't work, the things that we did that just failed. You know, putting people at home without enough equipment, leaving large groups of people in offices, forgetting about how you deal with kids and families and stuff. People are getting much better at actually working out that they don't want to do what they did last time. So those top 4 just keep coming out from my people. To do that, what you really want to do is answer 6 questions. What happened, why it happened, how it happened, who it happened to, what your reaction was, and how are you going to measure any changes? You can apply that lens to pretty much everything. And when I'm dealing with people, I'm seeing that people are saying, yeah, this is how everything is, but we don't know why, we don't know how. But the reality is most people do. You just need to facilitate and understand what's happening. There are things happening around organisations, and certainly in the world of airports, you know, your key client, the airlines, are just no longer there. So you know what's happened, and you know what's likely to happen. We are a country who will get back onto airplanes as soon as we can. We might not get onto them in the same way, but we will come back. So we know everything, but we need to know how we're doing things and why. So my big message of this whole thing is, let's grab the lessons now for what happened, what we did, how we did it, so we can learn for that next peak, that next trough, that next change. You know, just because we've got COVID now doesn't mean we don't have an Ebola-style situation. We still have measles. We've still got to get through seasonal flu season. We've still got to go through the potential for the electricity grid to go down. We still have the opportunity for our biggest clients to fail, or for people to come back in an unrealistic and unprepared way. So we've got to change the way we're ready to deal with people. So The lessons management process, and I've taken this straight from the Australian Emergency Resilience Institute's lessons management process, is a circular process. In an organisation that would have a real learning atmosphere, you're probably doing this all the time. So you go through a collection phase where you collect your lessons, your observations, you make sure you're analysing them, then you're implementing them, then you monitor and review that implementation. The problem is a lot of organisations, particularly after an emergency event, get really stuck on the collection. And the collection is probably one of the hardest parts to do by yourself as an organisation. So let's have a quick look at collection. So you collect data in a couple of ways, particularly after an event like COVID. You do it by observation. So you actually write down what you're seeing, what other people are seeing. You could take things as submissions. You can go and do interviews with people. You can write reports. And then the big one that lots of people rely on is do the debriefs. That collection process can give you a huge amount of information. But out of that, you need to write really good observations about what is actually happening. And that requires you to look at a couple of events through some very definite lenses. You've got to work out what you're seeing because of your history, what people are telling you because of their own views on the world, and you've got to bring those observations so they're clean and clinical. Thinking of an easy one, coffee worked well because the coffee machine was not affected. Fairly good observation. Poor observation, the coffee machine continued to work as planned, with all staff doing the right thing. There's a little bit of conjecture there. There's a little bit of attitude. So your observation writing is a little bit of a skill, and it's quite hard to do. But you can do it. It's a trainable activity. When you have your observations and you have your data, spending the time to analyse what you're seeing is incredibly valuable. There is a real need to interpret what you've seen and maybe go back to the scene, go back to the collection phase and actively question what's happening. Analysis isn't necessarily easy to everyone. Analysis takes a bit of practice. So you're going to interpret stuff, you're going to identify issues, you're going to discover insights, you're going to realize things that just don't work. And some of those insights are going to be quite personal. They're going to be personal to you, but they're going to be personal to other people. And it's really that point that you actually realize that activities that didn't work, people that didn't work, or people that stepped right up and did far more than you ever predicted or expected. And out of that, you're going to really identify the lessons that have come out of that first two segments. After that, this is where we're just moving into everyday management. You have to actually agree on what those lessons were and then make a definite decision on what is going to be implemented. And if you think to pretty much every Royal Commission, every inquiry, every coronial that's ever happened in Australia, we always read of the government accepting 15 of the recommendations, but not the other two. And then quite often it gets pushed off to a government department to implement, and we may never hear about it again. But behind the scenes, little things happen. If I think about my early career, following a series of really bad fireground incidents, we identified actually our chainsaw training was really good to teach people how to cut down trees. It was really bad to assess the overall risk and when that risk was allowed to be taken. So we had to then implement a system that identified when chainsaw use was appropriate, when it was appropriate with specific risk management in place, and when it was completely inappropriate. And we had to then implement that across all the bushfire brigades in New South Wales. a long and arduous task, but incredibly important for the organisation. Important for the people using the chainsaws, but probably more important for the organisation once you're looking at it as an organisation. And the final segment is pretty much what every manager in any organisation around Australia does, and every day is monitor and review. Monitor the implementation, report on it, review it, change it. Is it working? And then go back and start reporting again. It's a circular process. It happens over and over again. So it works really quite well as long as that first stage, the collection stage, is done really nicely. So if you look at the lessons learned, if you can do it as a mathematical symbol, it's a function of what's identified, how you analyse it, what you accept and then implement, and then review and actually implement. So it's a functional thing. It ends up with a life of its own, and you keep doing it. So collecting the early lessons now will actually allow you to start doing the analysis on what is happening now and then what you're going to accept next time, so that you have those plans. So how would you put it into practice practically? And I'd just like to go through a couple of things that I think you can achieve with an in-house program right now. The easiest thing to do right now is actually undertake a series of debriefs. So I'm doing some debriefs with the health department around the different phases of bringing Australians back from overseas and going into quarantine. And we've actually done these in segments. So the first segment was getting through the airport process. The second segment was transporting them and getting them into their rooms in the first 8 hours. And we've just done the first full set of quarantine periods. And it's been really good by breaking it into those segments, what has happened, what is happening, and then getting ready for what was happening and now has happened. We've addressed progressively the problems that we can deal with at the airport, the problems we can deal with in the transport in the first 8 hours, which are actually completely different to the problems of ongoing 14 days of operation of a quarantine period. So it's been really good. One of the things that are really hard to do internally is observation. You really struggle, or so many people struggle with observation internally. People aren't good at observing internally. You bring too many issues to the table. It's very hard to interview each other in an internal situation unless you've already got someone who plays that role as the chief auditor and actually has that relationship with the organisation. And an audit team can actually do this really quite effectively. Organisations don't tend to do submissions or reports internally to each other. You can, but you always have to read them with a touch of sort of questioning of how that's being sort of twisted for what they know you want to hear and what the boss wants to hear. So there's some issues about doing those bits internally. You can do debriefs really well, but to debrief well, you have to really have a very short time period and you have to manage it really carefully. Otherwise, people really struggle with differentiating from the facilitator's point of view. Are you asking them a question or are you criticising what they've said? Why would I admit this to an internal person? So you can achieve a really good debrief if you really lock the walls around when you're having the debrief. So if you were locking into the first 10 days of first 10 days of COVID operations, you could probably do it really well internally and not really need anyone externally. Writing good observations, you can learn to do that. You practice that, you do that. That's quite a talent. That's easy. So in-house, you can really do a debrief. You can analyse your debrief answers, you can work them out, you can do the small report, you can provide it up, and implementation and monitoring and review can, of course, be 100% done by your own organisation. I'm pretty strong on the belief, though, that you do actually need to stick to debriefs only unless you have a big organisation and you've got a strong audit or other type of internal review process who can or is used to standing aside from the rest of the working team and collecting that type of data and making those recommendations. So if you're doing a debrief, a couple of the tips and trips that I've really picked up over time. Give people preparation time. There's nothing worse than being told that you're going to go and do a debrief into the last 10 to 15, 20 days of operation tomorrow morning, this afternoon. Give people a couple of days. Give them some questions to start thinking about. Let them prepare what they've done and understand how it's happened. Next day, start the debrief with telling a story to have that session of debrief understand and get to an agreed story. And that could be done by the head of operations saying what they did, and then the head of catering saying what they did, and the head of visitor services saying that thing. Drawing it up on a big whiteboard, a timeline's fantastic of when people made decisions, but it allows everyone to tell their story up front, and people suddenly start bonding with both the facilitator and each other and realizing that some of the issues that you might have come up that people might think were really big, they start realizing, no, they actually happened for a reason. That happened because of that action, and they start changing the way they're going to react. After you tell your stories and you have a bit of an idea, identify any out of area questions, where your boundaries are, what you're doing here. If you're dealing with an airport and you're dealing with airside operations, make sure you don't start dealing with landside operations. If you're dealing with catering and visitor services, make sure that you don't start talking about how traffic was being run or how the emergency services turned up. Keep it with the expertise that's in the room. Keep it small, keep it manageable. The hard one, and I think anyone who does this professionally and facilitates a lot, this is the facilitator has to stay positive and constructive, and that is so hard, particularly when the whole room can go negative really quickly, but the facilitator is actually going to drive this where it goes. So if you're going to facilitate your own organisation, get all of your issues out of the way yourself. Tell them to the dog, tell them to someone else, vent, be calm, don't have a cup of coffee beforehand, don't hype yourself up, and just stay positive and constructive. Absolutely essential, because the minute you start going negative, everyone follows you. One thing I've discovered over the years is that you have to give people a way out. It's the ability for someone just to leave the debrief. It's the ability for someone to just go to the bathroom, go and get a cup of coffee. If they're feeling stressed, under tension, threatened, they have to have that ability to actually leave and then come back afterwards. Quite often I say to groups that I think this is going to happen, if you're getting up, can you sort of make a signal by, in the pre-COVID days, I used to say, just rub your chin as you're getting up when only I can see you, and then I'll understand that you're just taking a breather. But you've got to work out some way in your group to give people just a way out to get some space. And then finally, give folks some way to provide anonymous feedback, because there's always going to be something that someone can't say and they need to say it. You may never use it, but they need to get rid of it. And part of the debrief is actually giving people closure. And the closure can be as valuable as any lessons that you learn. You may not learn anything out of a debrief, but everyone might feel an awful lot better afterwards. So there's a couple of big zero blame questions that you can use for debriefs. And you can send people down a path so they can't blame someone else in the room, which is really easy, really important. I like to do what we did well, what worked well, how we did this well. Keep it well. So we start with the high points. This is really good. Do differently allows people to say, this didn't quite work, but it would have worked if we had this. We used Excel. Pardon me. We should have used a Word document. We could have done these things differently. It would have worked better. Do differently stops blame. And the final one you can have a bit of fun with, stop doing. The session I did yesterday was never, ever, ever do ever again, even if we're forced to do it. Something that gives someone a bit of a smile, because one of the things they come up with, they just say straight out, never do shift work again. Never start at 6 again. Or stupid, we should start at 4. It gets them into a really positive, happy frame of mind. That stop doing, we're not going to do it. Never, ever again. Very, very powerful. These thematic questions are ones that I've worked with Jack at the Belconnen Arts Centre. So an arts centre is a really fascinating organisation to go and do a debrief at, because you've got these disparate groups that use this location. They all have slightly different desired outcomes. They all have different amounts of money. They all don't necessarily like or agree with each other. They all see themselves as probably being more important than everyone else. You might parallel that perhaps to an airport terminal. I don't know, just thinking that. Jack and I came up with these for his debriefs. So our idea was that we'd actually get folks in a great big room as we were allowed to come back. We'd put some whiteboards out and we'd have a couple of people working the whiteboards for us. But Jack wanted to make sure he had such a big group he had to talk to have really quite targeted. So he wanted what was easier and what was harder than we thought it'd be, because he knew stuff was that they thought would be easy was harder, and what they thought was hard was easy. And that's actually a really powerful thing to do. So what worked and didn't work, so the same as our top 3 questions. What could we have done differently? Same as our top 3 questions. And an interesting one, what new practices can we continue to do, and what should we stop doing? So he was really looking at, if we're delivering services online or we're delivering services at our front counter, what works actually better than it worked under the old rules? What should we stop? What would never work again? And that's really been powerful for him in his situation. Next question, which is good if particularly if you're doing things like big building projects, or you're really moving a lot of stuff around something like a terminal and you're doing walls. What were you doing that you have to keep working towards? What programs were we working on? What training were you doing? Do we have to just come back? And then that very specific ones, which, I look at it now and, I'm seeing a parallel with a lot of airports. What do we learn about our communities? What do we learn about our relationships? What do we learn about our individuals? So we learn so much about how many people do things in this period and how they react. It's going to change the way we look at them going into the future. And that's going to be really, really important. Where we were is not necessarily where we're ever going to go back to, because this hasn't been a week of all being off work. This has been months. There are things that we used to do that we will have trouble remember doing. So what we learnt about our communities, our airlines, our businesses, our contractors, our consultants, and what we learn about one another will certainly change the way we view the future. Don't scrimp on your debriefs either. If you've got a couple of people just to do the boards, that's even better. A couple of people doing boards, particularly nowadays that we don't like sharing pens, a couple of people doing different boards at the same time will really give you a really great result. I'd like to wrap it up there, but I'd just like to call you a couple of really great resources. The COVID models on Nikki Case's site. So she's a young modeler from the US. She's got some really nice population models. They're not done from a medical point of view. She gets experts in to give her the medical modeling, but then she does all of the practical stuff. She's got some really lovely stuff on her site. So ncase.me is the big site, and most of her stuff's free, and her COVID model is really, really nice to actually understand how it works. The CIDRAP viewpoint, which is the sorry, I've forgotten completely what CIDRAP is. It's a university in the US, which is their viewpoint about where COVID is going, which actually puts up those 3 models. It's not a long read. It's about 10 pages. If you just type in CIDRAP viewpoint, you'll pick it up off the web really quickly. Easy read, really nice stuff. Please, that's my contact details. Give me a ring if you want to talk about something or I can help you with something. And I've got a couple of COVID resources that I'm sort of updating every now and then on my website, going to the website page. So I'm going to get Samantha back online and invite folks. Let's have a discussion, thoughts, ideas, what's worked well, what hasn't worked well that you've tried already. Samantha?
Thanks, Matthew. That was very informative. I really enjoyed that a lot. Thank you. We don't have any questions from the audience, but I do have a question. So in terms of, I mean, over the span of a 30-year career, I'm sure that you've seen a lot of, I guess, perhaps not pandemics, but different emergency and crisis situation. Have you noticed that over those 30 years to this point now, people are getting better at collecting this sort of information? Like, how have people adjusted to that new normal?
That's a good question. I think it's changed a lot. It's changed hugely. The sheer technology has allowed so many better ways of collecting post-event feedback. I think back to my early life, the only debrief you'd ever do was sort of with a crew at a truck. The idea of doing an organisational debrief that wasn't actually just window dressing, the boss standing up telling you you're all done really well. Here, put the ideas in the ideas box. Thanks. Let's get on with it. Just that was it. And that didn't happen. I'm seeing people are spending a lot more time doing debriefs, a lot more time doing reviews. I don't see the evolution into the lessons management process fully. There are some organisations, Attorney Generals with Emergency Management Australia was really running their lessons learned program well. AMSA do it really well because they are constantly looking at how they can refine, they can get oil spills better, and their responses better. So there are some organisations that have really taken a lessons management perspective, but it takes time and money. And I think that's the bit where lots of people just go, yeah, I'm not really going to spend money on that. Let's move on to the next thing. The problem is that that's when things go wrong because you don't learn from what's happened.
Yeah. The other question that I really have, and this is more of a, I guess, a personal question, not personal about you, I mean from me. So I did notice that, and it was happening with the bushfires a bit too. So what do you suggest people in a work environment do if there isn't an emergency management professional like on staff? How do you make those higher up more aware of what's going on? In terms of what I saw, even myself, was that people were refusing to believe what was actually happening, and they were really slow to react to that. And I think that while Australia overall did a really good job, there could have been, I guess, moves that we all made sooner. So I guess for people like me who aren't emergency management specialists, or people out there that might be listening, how do you actually convince those people that you work with, or the decision makers, that this is something to be taken seriously?
I think there's a couple of things there. If you think of the summer we've been through, I'm very carefully not going to use any words like unprecedented here, but we had this very different series of events. We had fires burning in places that we probably hadn't experienced fires burning before. We had a media focus on things, and depending on where you are in the media cycle, depending on your contact to the media cycle, depending on who you are, everything affects you slightly differently. I remember, so for those of you who aren't in Canberra, we had a massive hailstorm come through Canberra on the 16th of January, I think. I was standing in the centre of Canberra. I'd just had a cup of coffee with a friend. I'd headed to my car and my insurance company sent me a text message. My business insurance sent me a text message. My car insurance sent me a text message. I got 5 or 6 text messages from anyone other than the emergency services in a really short space of time. And even with all of my experience, that was the first time I then looked at the sky. And the sky looking to the west was purple and green and evil. I helped some older people find an undercover car park. I jumped back in my car and I raced to get to an undercover car park and didn't make it. And I sat in the middle of Kings Avenue Bridge as hailstones the size of, tennis balls battered my little Volkswagen. And it was at that point I thought, how didn't I know this was going to happen? I look at the weather every morning. How did I know? And it just wasn't on my radar. I wasn't even thinking hail, and that's ridiculous. I've lived in this city long enough to know that was prime hailstorm season. So why didn't I even think of that? So I think there's a need to get senior management and people who are actually looking after, I guess, the resilience of an organisation to have a look at what's happening in the world on a regular basis, and every now and then, what's the worst thing that can happen to us? And I go back to my earlier comment of the day that I sat with the teams and they said, no, COVID-19 is happening in China. It's not a viable activity. We have to find a different thing to cause this scenario. I find when I do a couple of little. I've got a really nice association with an organisation, and we do these little scenarios now every 2 weeks. It's only about an hour. It's sort of web based at the moment. What's happening, or have you thought about this? And people really enjoy it because, hey, this is a different thing. I remember working at Sydney Airport and then Ansett collapsing, and no one saw it. I certainly didn't see that coming at my level. We didn't see September 11, but we've bounced off this little grid. So what happens if measles comes back really hard this winter? What happens if flu comes back? What happens if we get foot and mouth now? What happens if our key suppliers just leave town? So there's lots of things that you can just do, and you just build that overall, that resilience to actually knowing, hey, no, we've thought about this, and we've actually thought about what we do. So, I remember, the hailstorm and people rushing around and watching people standing beside their cars that were absolutely trashed and being absolutely devastated, but not thinking, we had a hailstorm just like that 4 years earlier. It just hit at a different time of day and no one lost their houses. So you just have to keep that idea of, what happens if no one pays their AAA association fees this year? What happened? They're all really bad scenarios. What happens if the bank goes? I think just bring that little bit, a team meeting, really great time. Let's think of what we do if. Just start that resilience discussion.
Yeah, that's really great advice. Thank you, Matthew. Are there any more questions from the audience at all? Okay. We don't seem to have any, so that's okay. Matthew, you will make this presentation available to the AAA that we can send on?
Yes.
Excellent. So just at this stage then, I'd like to thank Matthew once again for providing the presentation. It was super informative and certainly very valuable considering the situation that we're all in now. Thank you everyone for participating in today's session. Today's webinar recording will be available in Airport Alert and emailed to everyone directly that dialed in once available. We encourage you to provide feedback on any other topics that you like. That you would like to see covered in the rest of the 2020 webinar series. Please email events@airports.asn.au. Thank you once again, and we look forward to your participation in our next webinar being held next Wednesday on the 10th of June. Have a good day, everyone, and thanks again, Matthew. Bye.